Native American history has become intertwined with U.S. history. One of the darkest chapters of this shared history is the Indian boarding school period that began in the late 1800s. For over 100 years, Native American children were taken from their homes and tribal communities and placed in boarding schools. Often the Native children were relocated hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles from their families for a long period of time. The practice of placing Native children in boarding schools became a policy of the U.S. government as a means to assimilate them. The goal was to take the Indian out of the children in hopes to Americanize them. But the objective was to erase and replace Indian culture. The mantra was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." It is estimated that up to 500,000 Native American children were removed from their families and placed in boarding schools, although the actual number may never be known. In 1928, the U.S. government released the Merriam Report that described substandard living conditions at Indian boarding schools in 26 states. The report revealed overcrowding, poor nutrition, and lack of proper medical treatment. Even with the Merriam Report's dismal findings, Indian boarding schools existed decades later with only limited improvements. There are still active boarding schools operating in the United States today. Many Native Americans, for multiple generations, have lived with the trauma associated with the Indian boarding school experience. Too often, that trauma has led to alcoholism, drug abuse, high rates of divorce, and suicide. Various Indian boarding schools have graveyards that contain the remains of Native children who died while attending the schools. There is a movement to have the remains returned. During the summer of 2021, the remains of 9 children were returned to the Rosebud Sioux tribe from Carlisle Indian Boarding School. That same summer, the world became aware of the legacy of boarding schools when the graves with the remains of 215 school children were found at the Kamloops Industrial Residential School in British Columbia, Canada. The discovery led U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland to establish a federal Indian boarding school initiative.
We must shed light on the unspoken traumas of the past, no matter how hard it will be.
The initiative will include an investigation to identify past boarding schools, the location of known and possible burial sites, and the identities and tribal affiliations of the children who were taken there. Throughout the summer, more graves at other residential schools were disclosed. Tribal communities throughout the United States began to take action towards healing by holding talking circles, rallies, and marches. But healing does not occur with a one-time event, but is a long journey. All of Indian country is waiting for the results of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative's findings, which are due in a report to Secretary Haaland by April 1st, 2022.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Native News Online's exclusive analysis of the Department of the Interior's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report that was just released today. It was released at noon. After the release, Secretary Deb Haaland and Assistant Secretary Brian Newland held a press conference that was quite emotional. Joining her was Deb Parker, and we will be back on the air at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time with Deb Parker, who runs the National American Indian Boarding School Coalition out of Minneapolis. So please join us at 4:30 today. Today, we have with us a very special guest who will help us analyze the findings in the report that was released. Joining us is Shannon O'Loughlin. Shannon is a tribal citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the CEO and attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs, the oldest nonprofit serving Indian country. Shannon has been practicing law for more than 21 years as a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So welcome, Shannon. And I want to talk about some of the findings. Yes. I want to talk about some of the findings in the report before we start talking to Shannon. The findings are that over 98.4 million sheets of paper were discovered in 39,000 boxes with relevant information. And the report today said that spread across 37 states, 53 burial sites were identified. 33 were with marked burial sites, unmarked where there were 6, and both marked and unmarked sites present at the school locations 14. And I want to say this, the report says that many of the locations will not be disclosed because of the real threat of grave robbery, desecration of graves, and so it's important that sometimes the government gets pushed back because of secrecy, but in this case, I think it's very appropriate. The report also indicates that there were 408 boarding schools in 37 states, including Alaska and Hawaii. Some individual Indian boarding schools accounted for multiple sites. The 408 federal boarding schools accordingly comprise 430 specific sites. So we're going to talk to Shannon now. And Shannon, I'm not sure how much of the report you've been able to. Oh, I'm sorry. And joining us also is our managing editor, Valerie Vandepan. And Valerie's coming to us from Florida. And I know, Shannon, you're outside of DC, as I recall. So welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Levi. I just want to add something that's really important about that report, and that is that the Department of Interior found that they expect to find tens of thousands more graves as their investigation continues. And, I think that that's a really important point just to underscore, that they're not even close to cracking just how many of these children died and were placed in marked and mostly unmarked graves.
And I think it's important to also note that whereas Secretary Holland called for, she established the Federal Boarding School Initiative last June at the mid-year conference for the National Congress of American Indians. She gave them like a 9-month window to come back with a report. So they're calling this report Volume 1. So just to be clear, we do not have all the answers. We mentioned the 98.4 million sheets of paper. It just almost be next impossible to really do a full investigation. And so there's going to be next phases, and the Volume 2. I'm thinking maybe Volume 3. I don't know. But Shannon, have you had a chance to digest the report yet?
But thanks, Levi. And I just want to apologize for my poor internet connection. I hope everyone's able to hear me. They also, not only did they find that there were 408 schools that they were looking at, but that they were also restricting what they were defining as federal boarding school institutions. And so still not clear to me how those numbers could potentially increase with the discovery of new records. So even the 108 number of schools, I think, is going to go up along with the number of children. Another thing I thought was a little concerning to me is on one hand, I was grateful that the report was put in the context of history, and that the boarding school policies came out of territorial termination, removing lands from Indian peoples and using education to achieve assimilation of Native peoples. But in that, territorial dispossession and boarding school education to assimilate, nowhere did the Department of the Interior say the word genocide. So they're talking about the actions without the intent. And I'm wondering if this report will ever lead us to that conclusion that these actions that the US government took against Native peoples was in fact genocide. Now, we heard it from Deb Parker. Deb Parker said it loud and clear that these actions are genocide, but nowhere in the report is that word used. I can keep going, Levi.
No, that's fine. And I'm okay with having a conversation because I think all of us who are Native, we are feeling particularly sad today. We were able, it was embargoed, but we got the report last night. So we went through 106 pages, and it was quite emotional for me to read it again. As I told my business partner a little while ago, it's like always removing these scabs. You have to keep removing these scabs that, you get diverted and you try to move on with other things. But when you come back to deal with the issue of boarding schools, and in my personal case, my grandmother went to a boarding school in Genoa, out in Nebraska. And so it's always had a really soft part of my heart, because she would never talk about it. Okay. And we remember looking down at her casket and seeing her tattooed wrist from the boarding school. And we looked, as I recall, it's like some of my siblings and cousins, we said, Grandma never really talked about it to us. And I would only surmise, I can only surmise the pain. And when you read some of the things that we have to read as journalists, and Shannon, in your work, the issue of the boarding school are pretty profound, and they're very, very painful to have to live through. And I remember reading the Merriam report last summer after Deb Haaland, and I keep calling her Deb Haaland, but Secretary Haaland, I do respect her position and think very highly of her. But when Secretary Haaland, after she established it, I went right to the Merriam report because I wanted to read it again, because I was familiar with it, but I wanted to reacquaint myself so I could write about it better. And even in that report, it said last year that as I read it, it was produced in, I think, 1927, and they talked about some of the conditions. And this report actually cites much of the Merriam report, the report that was released today. And as you said, Shannon, this has really becomes a historical document, and this really is a historic moment for American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians, because the Native Hawaiians are included in this report. And so I think that's the first time in the context of some of the things I've seen where the Native Hawaiians are included. And so the inclusion to me is pretty significant. And I am impressed with what the Department of the Interior is doing. And there may be some shortcomings to the report, but we're here to talk about it, analyze it today. And Valerie, what are some of your thoughts on the report?
Well, I just want to point out that it does not mention young Native children from Guam or Puerto Rico or any of the other U.S. colonies. And we know that those Native children were taken from those colonies and put in Native American boarding schools here in the United States. The report does not address any of them at all. Shannon, to your point about genocide, what do you think the likelihood is that criminal charges will ever come forth, or what kind of justice can be found with this, especially given that since the report goes through 1969 and there's a chance that some of the people who committed some of these atrocities are still alive? Can you speak a little bit to that, please?
There's so that we need to know about what happened, because it still continues to affect us today. I think a recognition that the acts of the United States was genocide can help us move forward and heal, instead of it being something something that's not talked about in the U.S. government. We've had Congress, we've had members of Congress talk about the way our ancestors and our children were treated as being genocide, but we've never had a full recognition by the U.S. government that these types of actions were in fact genocide. And one thing in the report that was we were happy to hear is that Native Hawaiians were addressed in the report, and sad to hear that indigenous relatives were not. I think there is so much more work to be done. I think what pops into my head with everything going on in news right now with our reproductive rights and other rights clearly shows what Felix Cohen was talking about when he said that federal Indian law and policy is like the miner's canary. Indian policy shows what is waiting for the rest of the world. And this is what happens when government terminates all choice of a people. Native people did not have a choice of what they could eat, of how we could educate our own children, of what religions we could practice. Even until this day, these issues of culture, religion, and education are kept from us. And so there's still a lot of work that we need to do. And I think we need to do together, not just as Indian country, but as citizens of the United States, to prevent these types of acts from ever happening again. As U.S. citizens, we have to maintain our choice to decide what happens to our own bodies, what happens to our families, what religion and culture and language we practice and speak. What was really powerful in the recommendations of the report was efforts to further cultural revitalization as a method of reparation, which is absolutely necessary, among other recommendations. And I hope we can talk a little bit more about the recommendations that DOI is discussing.
Yes, and we're going to put a slide up here in a few minutes. Now, how much of the report were you able to read? I'm not sure when you received it.
Yeah, I received it today, so I haven't had a whole lot of time with it, but I've been able to kind of review it very quickly and pull out pieces that were powerful.
Yes. And one thing that I don't think was quite in the report, but certainly Secretary Holland spoke about it today, is there's going to be like a year-long tour. She's going to go around the various locations in the United States. And obviously the schedule's not made out yet, but she wants to listen to survivors and maybe descendants of boarding schools, find out how boarding schools have impacted their lives even now. And one part of the report actually has a section about the health and the idea in terms of a road to healing, but also find out exactly like what type of, Native Americans, you look at the stats that are out there, suffer some of the highest health disparities of any racial ethnic group in the United States. The preponderance for diabetes, 3 to 4 times more, the cardiovascular diseases that exist among Native people, and on and on and on. And it seems like we're on some of the top of the worst list, but it almost appears to me like they want to try to connect the dots between those who survived boarding schools and those who have poor health now, and how it has impacted long term. Because as we know, the boarding school experience really has been a intergenerational trauma that has existed in Indian country. And Shannon, can you respond to some of the things I just talked about?
I think collectively, all of us who listened to the press conference earlier today, and even thinking and talking about it now, I've got this huge hole in my heart because my family also suffered from being a part of the boarding school system, and language and culture, health and security were all removed from my family personally because of Wheelock Seminary that many Choctaw young women went to in Oklahoma. We all suffer from this, and we're constantly being having to deal and explain to others why these issues are so important and why this work has to be done so that we can start the intergenerational healing process, instead of continuing to suffer from the intergenerational trauma that we have had decade after decade after decade. I'm still feeling like right now, my blood pressure is raised, my heart hurts, and I'm anxious when we talk about these things. And I think we all can personally recognize the pain that this has done to ourselves, families, our communities, and our nations, and how that affects everything that we do in our lives. I think that's why some of us, Levi, like you and I, why we are working in Indian country and trying to make these types of activities come to light so that other people can learn and heal from the work that needs to be done here. Again, this is the historic moment that finally these stories are getting the light of day. And I don't think if we, without Secretary Holland, I'm not sure that we could have made this headway on these.
I agree. I remember saying that last year, and sometimes I actually get choked up talking about it. The idea that Deb Holland was the right person for the right time. After the Camp Loops discovery of the 215 children, within 3 short weeks at the National Congress of American Indians, she established the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. And I have to think, had there been a non-native, and if we can just say it the way it used to be, a white male running the Department of the Interior, I'm thinking they would still be grappling with what should we do about this? What should we do about this? But instead, here is Secretary Holland speaking to the National Congress of American Indians. And she said that as she talked to her fellow employees, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, at the Department of the Interior, the indigenous employees, they wept together. And you really think about that. Today, as she opened the press conference, she was choked up. As she progressed, she was choked up. Assistant Secretary Brian Newland, who we know because he's from Michigan, I'm from Michigan, and we think very highly of Brian, the Assistant Secretary, for his accomplishments. But he broke up. He was all choked up. And so it really does, and Deb Parker was choked up. So it really does become very emotional for us. And it's not that we can't keep our emotions in check, but I like to keep saying it's always that constant nagging at the scab that we know is there. And anybody knows, any good mother teaches her child, leave that scab alone, leave that scab alone. But, on this case, I'm not sure we need to leave the scab alone. We need to really do a thorough investigation. And one of the comments that we already, since we've been on, somebody said, the survivors of some of the people, they lost their children, and we've done some live streams on this. They need to know where those children are. And as Deb Parker said today, our children need to be able to come home and give them good. Now, Shannon, your organization has done some fantastic work, and you've had some conferences on repatriation. Can you speak to how this Indian boarding school connects with what you guys do at your organization?
Sure. So we know that the Native American Protection and Repatriation Act mandates that federal agencies and museums, meaning any institution that has received $1 of federal funding, have requirements to consult with tribes and repatriate ancestors or burial belongings in sacred and cultural patrimony. We also know that Carlisle, an industrial boarding school, is currently run by the Army, and repatriation of children back to their original homes have been done with the Army. But the Army will not follow NAGPRA. Instead, it follows its own processes, which requires only a lineal descendant who can request return of that child, which is problematic because many children may not have an identity that we can connect to their family, but the child may be known as being tribally affiliated with a tribal nation. So the Army is only allowing lineal descendants to request return, and it requires those lineal descendants to basically fill out affidavits and legal forms in order to return. Whereas NAGPRA provides a much simpler process for the disinterment with consent of the affiliated nation, and allows for disinterment without having to prove lineage, just tribal affiliation. So NAGPRA could be a potential supporting method to help children come home. One of the things that needs to be resolved with NAGPRA is that many of the boarding schools are not currently on federal lands. There may have federal monies involved or other kind of federal oversight, but it may not be on federal lands. And the way NAGPRA is currently defined limits repatriation and disinterment from federal and or tribal lands. So that's a more restrictive definition that needs to be more broadly expressed in the act itself in order to make NAGPRA really work for boarding school issues. So we've been working a lot with trying to propose alternatives to NAGPRA or additions to NAGPRA that could help tribes return children home. Tomorrow, I believe that there will be a hearing on boarding schools. And let's see, we're all standing by. There, one.
Thank you.
I thought you left me here by myself.
No, I'm here. I'm outside and a garbage truck just drove by. So I wanted to just wait a second before I subjected everyone in the audience to painful noise on top of the painful discussion that we're having now. I want to get into the recommendations that the report makes, but I was hoping before we get to these recommendations, which are important, we'll talk about. But Shannon, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned earlier in our conversation, you asked us about, or you said something about the shortcomings of the report, and you said there were many. And I'm hoping you can speak a little bit more to that before we get into what we can do about it. Tell us where did the report fall short, and what can we hope for to come?
So first, know that it's really easy to pick apart what's missing and what's wrong. And it's much more difficult to talk about the positive. So I really want us to acknowledge that there's a lot of positive in this report. The 8 recommendations that the report makes are really, they're nothing that tribes haven't been asking for. But final recognition and acknowledgement of what needs to happen to cure the problems that boarding school and other assimilation policies have had. So the report is doing a lot. a lot of good. Where I would start to pick it apart as my concern is the limited definition of what a federal Indian board school system is defined as. So I believe there were 4 points. I don't have them in front of me, but if you'd like to read through them, it involves there has to be some sort of federal funding and oversight. I believe there's a provision of how the lands could have been given for the purpose of the boarding school, and a couple of other definitions that kind of restricts what the Department of Interior is looking at and calling a federal boarding school. So institutes like asylums or day schools and other schools that may have been purely religious are not included in this list of 408. And so I'd really like to see when we're going to expand it, and if the Department of Interior and the federal government are going to push for mandatory disclosure of information from any private institutions or cemeteries on private lands that the Department of Interior may not have current jurisdiction over.
Shannon, you bring up an excellent point, because part of the report does say that, and it's even in one of the recommendations, it says support the release from independent other bodies, and that would include state governments perhaps who may have run the boarding schools, religious organizations, and maybe even other organizations. And I really do believe, because the report indicates that about 50% of those boarding schools that they've identified were operated and or supported by religious organizations. And even today's data, the information included in the report, very little, if any, of those records are part of the documentation in the report today. And so I would love to see a little more teeth into religious organizations. And I'm not sure how you do that if it comes down to, they said, I know last summer we tried to reach the diocese of Gaylord that ran an Indian school up in Harbor Springs, Michigan, and they were non-responsive to our telephone calls. And there was numerous calls that went into the diocese, and if they don't want to cooperate, it seems to me the federal government should develop a means to require them, whether it's getting the Department of Justice involved, where you literally subpoena them. And I'm just talking. I'm not a lawyer, but you are, Shannon. What would you say would be a way that the federal government could? I want to use the word compel them to have them turn over those documents that may exist out there in their own private collections or files.
Yeah, so let me use NAGPRA as a great example to showcase this. So NAGPRA only applies to federal agencies and public hands and public lands. It doesn't apply to private lands. And we've seen that as hugely problematic. On one hand, you have this extremely strong human rights statement with NAGPRA, that these types of items have been stolen and looted and put on the market for sale, and in boxes and boxes in basements, in institutions and otherwise. So the federal government has declared this strong policy against having Native American collections, and that they be repatriated. But yet private entities and individuals still continue to profit off of our ancestral remains and other cultural and religious items. So it's a little bit hypocritical, and I'm seeing that same framing of these issues here in the DOI report, and that is problematic. If we're going to solve these issues, we have to have it applicable to wherever we find it, wherever the wrong is, we have to address it, regardless of whether it's a private entity or the federal government. Look at endangered species laws. Look at clean water, clean air acts. Those are regulatory frameworks that absolutely apply regardless of where the endangered species is. If an eagle feather drops and lands outside this hotel that I'm staying in right now, on the land of the Yaqui and the Otam, I have no right to that eagle part. The federal government has take it away, but that kind of wholesale prohibition is not expressed in NAGPRA. It's not expressed in how the Department of Interior is looking at this research into boarding schools and where the reach is going to be. I want to see this reach expanded regardless of the entities involved.
Thank you for getting into that. I think that's a good place to start talking about the recommendations that are made. The first one is, of course, to continue full investigation of what's happening. What gave me hope is that they did call this volume 1. So hopefully there will be many, many more volumes to come. Their second recommendation is to identify all surviving Indian boarding school attendees. That seems very logical and like an important step to take as well. Document all those experiences. I think that also, let's go for it. There's going to be 8 of them, so I'm going to go through all 8 of them now. Number 4 is support protection, preservation, reclamation, and co-management of sites across the federal Indian boarding school system where the federal government has jurisdiction over the location. They recommend developing a specific repository of federal records involving the Indian boarding school system and keep them at the Department of Interior Library for preservation. They want to identify and engage other federal agencies to support this initiative. They want to support non-federal entities that may independently release records under their control. And they want to support congressional action on a number of issues, including NAGPRA, Native language and revitalization, Indian health research, and they want to recognize the generations of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children that experienced the federal Indian boarding school system with a federal memorial. That is all 8 of their recommendations, succinctly. If you're interested, if you're just joining us, we are talking about the Department of Interior's released report today, Volume 1 on federal Indian boarding schools. You can find a link to that report on our website, nativenewsonline.net. It is the top story there. Click on that and you'll see the report will be linked to in that website or in that web story. Shannon, briefly, with all those recommendations, is that enough?
It's interesting that they're putting a lot of emphasis on gathering stories and information from current boarding school survivors. I think that's extremely important and the most painful part of the process. It's also a little concerning because I have a problem with the federal government wanting to take care of our stories and wanting to have control of our stories and the documents that have to do with our histories. I wonder if there could be more either co-management with an organization such as the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and other Native orgs, or with tribes to co-manage the documents and stories that belong to them. I think that is one of the recommendations that I find highly suspect. Though we trust Auntie Holland and the reasons why she wants to gather these stories, right? But for the long run, there has to be tribal control and tribal, at least, co-management of all of this information that's being collected.
Shannon, you bring up an excellent point, because Secretary Holland, as much as all of we Native Americans love to see her in there a long, long time, she will not be there forever. And who's to say that the next secretary said, you know what, this is nonsense. We don't need to do this. Now, I don't say that any negativity, because it is not nonsense. I'll be clear about that. But non-natives are not nearly as they don't hold these things dear to our hearts. So you bring up an excellent point that really needs to be brought to the attention. To our viewers out there, there are some hearings that are taking place in Washington this week on Capitol Hill. They're working very hard to. We have a story on Native News Online. I think it was published on Monday or Tuesday. You can go there and look at the story that deals with kind of a call to action. You actually have the capability of contacting your senators. All of us in our 50 states have 2 senators, U.S. senators. We have representatives, people in the House that you need to reach out to. And I don't have the numbers before me, but certainly on our website, we have the information. But you really need to advocate that Congress really does set this commission in place that they are advocating for, so that there can be more federal dollars to really dive into this thing and do it right. I know here in the state of Michigan, there's some legislation in the state legislature that our governor has put forth in the state budget that I want to say calls for like $2 million. We did a story on it a couple months ago that really would work within the next 18 months, once it gets passed signed into law, that would investigate the boarding schools here in Michigan. And so at different levels, there are, just for our viewers, and we're getting a lot of great comments today, and we apologize, we can't get to all those questions and reply to everybody, but Native News Online is committed. We stand committed to doing our part to inform the public as to what's going on. Many of our viewers and readers are not Native, so in some of them become our allies. So we need our allies to really work on behalf. This Indian boarding school, as Assistant Secretary of the Interior Brian Newland said today, every single American Indian, Alaskan Native Hawaiian has been impacted by Indian boarding school experiences, and so that's critical to talk about it. Shannon, do you have any closing remarks? We're going to bring this to a close because we're going to have Deb Parker on at 4:30 today, asking her some of the same questions. So we ask our viewers to turn back in. We're not a television program, but we certainly, through our social media channels, YouTube, Facebook, we like to provide these live stream interviews. And Shannon, do you have any closing remarks?
Yes, I want to recognize Assistant Secretary Brian Newland and his remarks about the Indian Child Welfare Act, because one of the things that was put forward, Association on American Indian Affairs was strong in and helping to develop was that act to end adoption, or at least curtail adoption of our Indian children to non-Indian families, and require Native families to stay together. And I think one of the ongoing healing that our nations must undertake is to strengthen the Indian Child Welfare Act, and to make sure the Indian Child Welfare Act doesn't get overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court this October, which will put us backwards into looking at what life was like for our children and families when state officials could easily remove our children and put them into where they was a better Western European styled education system, which is us being in control of our children, making choices for children, and for their education and their cultural development.
And Shannon, well, I want to thank you on behalf of Native News Online. You do wonderful work at the Association of American Indians. Keep doing the strong work you're doing, and we hope to have you back sometime soon to talk about more of these issues. You are so knowledgeable, and I have the utmost respect for the work that you do. So, Chi Miigwech from Native News Online. And to our viewers, I've been saying mistakenly that it's at 4:30 today. Our live stream with Deb Parker is at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. So please make note of that. Tune back in. And I want to say this: after the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative was put in place last summer, Native News Online went out and we created a plan to do several of these live streams, and I need to mention the sponsors, because this is we really appreciate the support that we've gotten from our sponsors. We have the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana that was a major sponsor. Yahoo News, Yahoo Incorporated, my personal tribe, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, they have contributed the Bois Forte Tribal Government, Kagan Band of Potawatomi Indians, and the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians here in Michigan. So I want to thank those sponsors for keeping our live streams going. As the report indicates today, the work continues, and so we will continue to do live streams as we see fit. And so thank you very much. And we know that the subject matter was very difficult today, but it is something that really needs to be talked about, discussed as we move forward as Indian country, see the progress of Indian country. So Chi Miigwech for tuning in today. Thank you very much.
And I just want to add, please, everybody, if this is your first time experiencing Native News Online, be sure to like our social channels. Be sure to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and stay tuned. We've just now, this is really starting a new chapter of our coverage of this issue and our healing journey. So we thank you for tuning in, for sitting with us through this conversation. We know it is a challenge, and we appreciate your support. Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments and your interaction, and be sure to check in with us back at 4 p.m. Eastern as we talk to Deb Parker. Thank you.